The stars stretched endlessly, a vast ocean of twinkling lights and shadowy nebulae. A lone human warship drifted silently, its dark hull blending with the void around it. Inside, the crew of the Resolute prepared for what they hoped would not be their final battle. The war between humanity and the Galactic Coalition had raged for years. It was a war no one expected. A clash between a race that had only just reached for the stars and an alliance of ancient, powerful species that had ruled the galaxy for millennia. Humanity had stumbled upon them by accident, launching into deep space only to find themselves surrounded by a network of civilizations far older and more advanced. At first, the Coalition had ignored them, seeing humanity as little more than an interesting curiosity, a fledgling race on the outskirts of their domain. But humanity was resilient, and their rapid technological progress had surprised the galaxy. When a human exploration vessel entered restricted space, a territory fiercely guarded by the Coalition, everything changed. The Coalition issued a warning, but the humans, unaware of the danger, pushed further. A skirmish followed, and within days, the galaxy was at war. The Coalition's leaders, seeing the human expansion as a potential threat, decided to end the conflict quickly. They sent their fleets to crush the upstart species before it could establish a foothold in galactic politics. But humanity fought back. The warship Resolute was one of the last remaining symbols of human defiance. Commanded by a seasoned captain named Alara Dorn, it had survived countless battles against the Coalition. Its crew was tired, its hull scarred from years of combat, but it was still in the fight. On the bridge of the Resolute, Alara stared out at the darkness. Her thoughts were heavy with the weight of the mission ahead. Intelligence reports had indicated that a Coalition fleet was moving toward one of the last human colonies, a desperate attempt to crush what remained of humanity's resistance. The Resolute had been tasked with stopping them, but Alara knew the odds. The Coalition fleet was vast, made up of ships from multiple alien species, each more powerful than anything humanity could field. The Resolute was a formidable vessel, but it was just one ship. Alara, "We're picking up movement," said Soren, the ship's tactical officer. He was young but had quickly proven himself in the heat of battle. His hands danced over the controls, bringing up a display on the main screen. "It's them, the Coalition fleet. They'll be within firing range in 20 minutes. Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the incoming ships. "How many?" Soren hesitated. 17 confirmed ships. Could be more behind them. 17 ships. The Resolute was alone. The weight of that fact pressed down on Alara, but she couldn't let it show. Her crew needed her to be strong. "Prepare the weapons," she said calmly. "We'll engage when they're in range." The bridge crew moved swiftly, each officer at their station, preparing for the inevitable battle. Alara moved to stand beside Soren, looking at the tactical display. "Their formation is tight," Soren said quietly. "They're not expecting much resistance. They're expecting us to run," Alara replied. "They've seen what's left of our fleet. They think we're finished." Soren glanced at her. "Are we?" Alara didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. The truth was, humanity's position was dire. Their colonies were scattered and isolated, their military forces dwindling. But surrender wasn't an option. The Coalition had made it clear that humanity was to be subjugated or eradicated. There would be no peace, no negotiations. "We're not finished," Alara said finally. "Not yet." The minutes ticked by, and the tension on the bridge grew. Alara could feel it, the unspoken fear in the air. Every crew member knew that this might be their last mission, their last stand. But they had all chosen to be here, to fight. "Captain," came a voice from the communications officer. "Incoming message from the Coalition fleet. They're demanding our surrender." Alara glanced at Soren, who shook his head. "They won't offer terms. They never do." "Put it on the screen," Alara ordered. The main display flickered, and the face of a Coalition commander appeared. He was alien, his features angular and severe, his skin a pale shade of blue. His eyes, cold and calculating, studied Alara for a moment before he spoke. "Human vessel. This is Commander Vaughn of the Galactic Coalition. You are outnumbered and outmatched. Surrender now, and your crew will be spared." Elara stood tall, her expression unreadable. "Commander Vaughn, I'm afraid surrender isn't an option." Vaughn's lips curled into a sneer. "Then you will be destroyed, like the rest of your kind. Your resistance is futile. You cannot win." "We'll see," Elara replied, her voice steady. Vaughn's image disappeared, and the screen returned to the tactical display. The Coalition fleet was closing in, their ships moving in formation like predators circling wounded prey. Elara turned to Soren. "All power to the forward shields. Prepare to engage." The crew worked quickly, their movements precise despite the looming threat. The Resolute surged forward, its engines roaring to life as it moved to meet the Coalition fleet head-on. The first shots were fired moments later. Beams of energy lanced through space, lighting up the darkness with brilliant flashes of light. The Resolute dodged and weaved, its shields flaring as they absorbed the incoming fire. "Return fires," Elara ordered. The warship's guns roared to life, sending a barrage of missiles and energy beams toward the enemy ships. The Resolute was outnumbered, but it was fast and agile, darting between the larger Coalition vessels, striking hard and then retreating before they could retaliate. But the Coalition fleet was relentless. Their ships, designed for warfare over centuries, were powerful and heavily armored. No matter how many times the Resolute struck, it seemed like the enemy was always one step ahead, always regrouping and closing in. "We can't keep this up forever," Soren said through gritted teeth, his hands flying over the controls as he tried to outmaneuver the enemy ships. Elara knew he was right. They were buying time, but every second brought the enemy closer to overwhelming them. She had to think of something, some way to turn the tide. "Target their command ship," she ordered. "If we take out their leader, the rest might hesitate." Soren nodded and adjusted the ship's course. The Resolute angled toward the largest of the enemy vessels, a massive dreadnought bristling with weapons. It was heavily guarded, but Elara knew it was their best shot. "Focus all fire on that ship," Elara said. "We're going to punch a hole right through their defenses." The Resolute charged forward, its weapons blazing. The dreadnought loomed ahead, its shield shimmering as it absorbed the incoming fire. But the Resolute pressed on, closing the distance, refusing to back down. "Shields at 20%, came the call from one of the officers. "We're almost there," Elara said, her eyes fixed on the enemy ship. "Just a little longer." Suddenly, the Resolute was rocked by a massive explosion. Elara was thrown from her feet as the lights flickered and alarms blared. Smoke filled the air, and the ship system struggled to maintain power. "Damage report," Elara shouted as she pulled herself up. "Portside engines are down." Soren called back. "We've lost main power to the weapons. Shields are failing." Elara's mind raced. They were out of time. The dreadnought was still intact, its weapons powering up for a final strike. "We have to retreat," Soren said urgently. "If we stay, we're dead." Elara hesitated. They had come so far, fought so hard. But he was right. If they stayed, they wouldn't be able to warn the colonies. The Coalition would wipe them out. "Set a course for the nearest jump point," Elara ordered, her voice tight with frustration. The Resolute turned and fled, its engine sputtering as it limped away from the battle. The Coalition fleet pursued for a short time, but then pulled back, satisfied that the human ship was no longer a threat. As the Resolute entered the safety of jump space, Elara sank into her chair, her body aching from the strain of the battle. They had survived, but the cost had been high. "We'll live to fight another day," Soren said quietly, standing beside her. Elara nodded, though the weight of their losses hung heavy in the air. The war wasn't over, and as long as there was a chance, they would keep fighting. As the Resolute sped through the silent void of jump space, the crew fell into a tense quiet. The damage from the battle was significant, but the fact that they had survived at all was a testament to their skills and the ship's durability. Elara leaned back in her command chair, her mind swirling with thoughts of the battle they had just escaped and the inevitable ones to come. "We've got to fix what we can before we reach the colonies," she said, her voice tired but resolute. "Soren, give me an estimate on how long until the Coalition can track us down." Soren's fingers moved swiftly over the console, bringing up calculations. He frowned as he read the data. "They'll have a rough idea of where we're headed, but we've got at least 12 hours before they can pinpoint our location and follow," he said. "That's if their fleet doesn't jump immediately, but I don't think they expect us to be in fighting shape anytime soon." "We're not," Elara muttered, casting a glance at the damage reports streaming across her personal screen. The Resolute was in rough shape. It was a miracle they'd even managed to get away. "We'll need every second we can get." She stood and began to pace the length of the bridge, her mind working to form a plan. They couldn't just run forever. The Coalition's resources were nearly limitless, and their fleets could track human movements with terrifying accuracy. The war had become a game of cat and mouse, and humanity was running out of hiding places. "What about the colony at Tryon V?" asked Harla, the communications officer, her voice hesitant. "Could they offer repairs or reinforcements?" Elara stopped pacing, her brow furrowing. Tryon V was one of the last human strongholds, a colony that had managed to stay hidden from Coalition forces so far. It was deep in neutral space, protected by dense asteroid fields and dangerous nebulae that made navigation difficult for larger fleets. If they could reach Tryon V, they might have a chance to regroup, but it was also a risk. The Coalition was methodically hunting down human outposts, and any action could expose the colony's location. "We could try," Elara said slowly, "but we'd be leading the Coalition right to them if we're not careful. We need to think strategically. We don't have the luxury of mistakes." Soren glanced up from his console. "We could drop a few decoys along the way, throw them off our trail." Elara nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good idea. Do we have the resources for it?" "Barely," Soren said, "but we can rig some of the damaged drones. They won't last long, but it might buy us enough time to repair the critical systems." "Do it," Elara ordered, then turned her attention to Harla. "Open a secure channel to Tryon V. I want to make sure they're prepared in case things go south." The communications officer nodded and began working on the encrypted transmission. While she waited for a response, Elara returned to her chair, her eyes scanning the tactical display. Every decision now carried immense weight. One wrong move, and they could doom the colony and their entire race. Minutes passed in tense silence until the channel finally opened. A familiar face appeared on the screen. The governor of Tryon V, an older man with a sharp gaze and silver hair that belied his age. "Elara," he greeted her with a nod, his voice calm but serious. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon. Is the situation as bad as I fear?" "It's worse," Elara replied grimly. "The Coalition is closing in. We barely escaped an ambush, and we're bringing more trouble your way. Our ship's in bad shape. We'll need repairs if we're going to keep fighting." The governor's expression hardened. "We've got some resources left, but not much. We can offer you what repairs we can. But if the Coalition follows, we won't be able to hold them off." "I know the risk," Elara said. "We'll do everything we can to keep them off your radar. I just need to know if we have your support." The governor looked down, clearly weighing the options in his mind. Tryon V was already stretched thin, its defenses relying on stealth and its remote location. If the Coalition discovered them, they'd be wiped out like so many other colonies. But humanity had so few options left. "You'll have our support," the governor said finally. "But be quick. We can't afford a prolonged stay." Elara nodded. "Thank you. We'll be there within the day." The transmission ended, and Elara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She turned back to her crew. "All right, people. We're heading to Tryon V, Soren. Get those decoys ready. Harla, I want constant monitoring of Coalition movements." The crew sprang into action, but the weight of the task ahead lingered in the air. As the Resolute continued its journey through the depths of space, the damage control teams worked tirelessly to patch up what they could, hoping against hope that their warship would be ready for the next inevitable battle. Hours passed in a blur of repairs and preparation. The crew moved with practiced precision, but the strain was beginning to show. Everyone aboard the Resolute knew that this was a war of survival. Every battle they won only bought them a little more time, and every failure could be their last. Ilara sat in the dimly lit briefing room, poring over intelligence reports and strategies when Soren entered quietly. He leaned against the doorframe, his face set in that familiar mix of determination and exhaustion. "We've done what we can with the decoys," he said. "They should give us a bit of breathing room, but it won't hold them off forever." Ilara nodded, her eyes still fixed on the map spread before her. "It doesn't need to last forever, just long enough." Soren studied her for a moment, then sighed. "You know, if we keep this up, if we keep fighting like this, we'll run ourselves into the ground." Ilara looked up at him, her expression hardening. "What choice do we have?" "I'm not saying we stop fighting," Soren said carefully, "but there has to be another way. A different kind of fight. Maybe we can find a weakness in the coalition that they haven't accounted for." "And how do you suggest we find that?" Ilara asked, her voice low. Ilara's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about taking the fight directly to them. If we can rally enough support from other species, those who resent the coalition's rule, we might have a chance to turn the tide." It was a bold idea, but also a dangerous one. Striking at the coalition's core could provoke an even more brutal response. But at this point, it was a risk worth considering. Humanity had been on the defensive for far too long. "I'll think about it," Ilara said finally, her tone cautious. Soren nodded and left the room, leaving Ilara alone with her thoughts. The war had taken so much from her already. Friends, comrades, and even her sense of peace. But one thing it hadn't taken was her will to fight. She couldn't let it. Not while humanity still had a chance, however slim. The journey to Tryon V took longer than expected. The Resolute forced to make several detours to avoid coalition patrols. The decoys did their job for a time, drawing the enemy away from their path, but the coalition was persistent. They had been hunting the human fleet for years now, and they weren't going to let one ship slip away so easily. By the time the Resolute reached Tryon V, the damage to the ship was extensive. Fires had been put out, engines were barely holding together, and some systems were offline entirely. But they had made it. As the Resolute descended toward the hidden colony, Ilara watched the planet come into view. It was beautiful, a lush world teeming with life. It was hard to believe that it was one of the last strongholds of humanity, a fragile refuge in the midst of a dying war. The colony's landing bay opened to receive them, and the Resolute touched down with a shudder. Repair crews were already waiting, swarming over the ship the moment the ramp lowered. Ilara disembarked with Soren at her side, the two of them greeted by the governor and his aides. "You've got a tough road ahead," the governor said as they shook hands. "But we'll do what we can to patch her up." "How long do we have?" Ilara asked, looking around at the bustling activity. The governor's expression was grim. "Not long. We've picked up coalition signals on the edge of the system. You've probably got a few hours at most before they're on top of us." Ilara nodded. "Then we'll make them count." As the Resolute underwent critical repairs, Ilara convened with her senior officers and the colony's leaders. They didn't have much time, but they had to come up with a plan. If they were going to survive this next encounter, they needed more than a temporary patch on the ship. They needed a strategy that would allow them to not just escape, but to deal a meaningful blow to the coalition. Ilara stood at the center of the war room, staring at the holographic projection of the planet and the approaching coalition fleet. Her mind raced through possibilities, and one by one, most of them seemed impossible. But there was still one option. "We won't be able to outrun them this time," Ilara said, addressing the gathered officers and colony leaders. "Even with the repairs, we're not in any shape for another prolonged fight. And if we don't protect Tryon V, we'll be dooming the last of our people." The governor folded his arms, his face grim. "What are you suggesting?" Ilara glanced at Soren, and he gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. We lure them in close, closer than they would expect. We make them think we're desperate, that we're making a final stand. And then we detonate. A ripple of shock moved through the room. One of the younger officers, Lieutenant Arik, frowned in confusion. Detonate? What do you mean? Soren stepped forward. There's an old mining facility on Trine V, deep in the planet's crust. It's still packed with volatile explosives from before the war. If we can draw the Coalition fleet into the right position, we can trigger a massive explosion, large enough to take out the majority of their ships in one blow. The room fell into a stunned silence as the weight of the plan sank in. It was audacious, dangerous, suicidal, even. But in the grand scheme of things, it was also their best and perhaps only chance at survival. We can rig the explosives to detonate remotely from the ship, Ilara continued. But the Resolute will have to get dangerously close to the surface. We'll need to keep the Coalition engaged long enough to ensure they're within the blast radius. One of the colony engineers, an older woman named Kyra, looked uncertain. Even with that explosion, we can't guarantee it'll wipe out their entire fleet. And if any ships survive, Ilara nodded, we'll still have to fight. But taking out even half their fleet will give us a fighting chance. We can pick off the survivors and hopefully delay their pursuit long enough for the colony to evacuate. We'll buy humanity time. The governor leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. His expression was one of weary acceptance. This is the best plan we've got, but make no mistake, if we fail, Trine V will be annihilated. We won't fail, Ilara said, her voice steady. This is our moment. It's time we hit back. The plan was set in motion almost immediately. The explosives were prepped, and the crew worked tirelessly to get the Resolute in the best shape possible for what would likely be its final mission. The mood on the ship was somber but determined. They all knew the risks, but they had long since made their peace with those risks. The next morning, as the sun rose over Trine V's rugged landscape, the Coalition fleet appeared on the edges of the system. The countdown to battle began. Captain, the Coalition ships are entering range, Soren said from his station, his voice tense. Ilara stood on the bridge, staring at the tactical display. The massive enemy ships slowly moved into position, spreading out to cover any potential escape routes. Their overwhelming presence was almost suffocating, but Ilara kept her gaze fixed ahead. Wait for my signal, Ilara said, gripping the armrest of her chair. The seconds ticked by like hours. Every instinct screamed for her to act, but she forced herself to remain calm. The timing had to be perfect. Finally, the Coalition ships moved into the target zone. They were closing in on the Resolute, preparing for what they assumed would be the final kill. Now, Ilara barked. The Resolute fired every weapon it had, a barrage of missiles and energy blasts streaking toward the Coalition fleet. The enemy ships returned fire, but the Resolute twisted and turned through space, dodging as much of the onslaught as it could. At the same time, deep beneath the surface of Trine V, the mining charges began to hum with energy. The explosives were rigged, and their countdown had begun. Steady, Ilara called out, watching the tactical display closely. They were almost there. The Resolute dove toward the planet, angling sharply to bring the enemy ships closer. Coalition vessels gave chase, thinking they were closing in for the kill. As they neared the atmosphere, Ilara gave the final order. Detonate. The shockwave was instantaneous. The mining charges erupted in a colossal explosion that shook the entire planet. A blinding flash of light that tore through space. The force of the blast was so immense that it rippled outward, consuming everything in its path. On the bridge of the Resolute, Ilara and her crew watched in stunned silence as half of the Coalition fleet was obliterated in a matter of seconds. Massive ships were torn apart, their hulls crumbling like paper in the face of the explosion's fury. The surviving Coalition ships, caught off guard and disoriented by the sudden attack, faltered. Their formations broke apart, and the once organized fleet descended into chaos. Now's our chance, Ilara shouted. Target the survivors. The Resolute roared back into action, its weapons firing relentlessly at the remaining coalition vessels. The once imposing fleet had been shattered, and with their ranks broken, the surviving ships were vulnerable. The Resolute moved with precision, taking out ship after ship. The crew worked in tandem, each person fully aware that this could be their final battle, but determined to make every shot count. After what felt like an eternity, the last coalition ship was reduced to flaming debris. The sky above Tryon V was filled with the wreckage of what had once been an unstoppable armada. The planet, though scarred by the explosion, remained intact. The battle was over. Illyra slumped back in her chair, the weight of the moment finally catching up to her. The Resolute had survived. They had won, at least for now. "We did it," Soren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We actually did it." Illyra turned to him, a weary smile on her face. "We bought humanity some time. That's all we ever wanted." The victory was bittersweet. They had struck a major blow against the coalition, but the war was far from over. More fleets would come. The galaxy was still vast, and the coalition's reach was long. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope. As the crew of the Resolute began to take stock of the aftermath, Illyra gazed out at the stars. The war had cost them so much, and it would cost more before it was done. But humanity had survived the impossible, and they would keep fighting. Because as long as there was a chance, even the smallest chance, they would endure. And so would the Resolute.